So after this intro, we'll go straight into the main presentation by Richard Smith and John Moromutu. This will then be followed by a short response and a discussion with Kaia Ambrose. After that point, we'll then take your questions. Again, I remind you, you can submit them at any time, but we'll take them after Kaia's had her bit. And there we go. We're also assuming that the majority of people are familiar with outcome mapping. This webinar won't be introducing outcome mapping as a method, but it'll be talking about a particular study, which I'll introduce very shortly. But we just wanted to see what experience do you have of outcome mapping so far. So I've got another quick poll. This time, just tick the boxes that apply to you. Have you applied, or are you applying at the moment outcome mapping in your work? Have you attended an outcome mapping workshop? Have you read the outcome mapping manual? Do you follow the discussions on the outcome mapping community? Or perhaps none of the above? Perhaps actually you're quite new to outcome mapping. Okay, I'll just give you another few seconds to reply. We've got a good response. I'm going to close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we've got 90% of people responded, which is great. And here are the results. So actually, almost half of you have applied or are currently applying outcome mapping, which is fantastic. A quarter of you have attended an outcome mapping workshop. More than half of you have read the manual, which is good. And more than half of you follow the online discussions. And under 10% of you are completely new to outcome mapping. So welcome to those that are less familiar with outcome mapping. I hope you'll be able to follow the discussion. Some of it will assume a general knowledge of outcome mapping, but just as a very brief overview for you, outcome mapping is a methodology that was developed about 10 years ago by the Canadian agency, the International Development Research Centre. And it's a method that focuses very much on trying to understand behaviour change in social change projects. So it's all oriented to help projects to plan, monitor and evaluate based on behaviour change. If you want to read more, please see the website. There'll be links at the end of this webinar, and we'd love to have you join us in the online community. So let me introduce the presenters today. Richard and John are researchers. They're independent consultants, and together with Cornelia Rasman, the three of them have worked together for a number of years and are now embarking on sort of independent careers, of which outcome mapping plays a big part. And they have undertaken a study which was commissioned by the outcome mapping learning community back in October last year. And the study was aimed to map the state-of-the-art of outcome mapping practice, to find out where it's being used, how it's being used, and also what support is needed for applying outcome mapping. The main purpose of the study was to inform us, the outcome mapping community stewards, to learn more about the shape of the community, the shape of users, and to help us develop our support strategies, because our mission is all about helping outcome mapping users and to support and encourage its use. The report that they've produced is fantastic, and it's already provided us with a lot of food for thought, and we also think it's going to be very useful for all users of outcome mapping. You'll see on the outcome mapping website that there are two versions of the report. There's the full report, and there's also a summary report. So we encourage you to read those after the webinar. The presentation that they give will be followed by a discussion from Kaia Ambrose. And Kaia has been an outcome mapping steward for, I think, for over 7 years actually. And she's currently the Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Manager for CARE Canada. And so she'll be sharing some of her thoughts, some of her interpretations of the research, and providing, I hope, all of you with some ideas on how this research can be useful for you. I've just seen a question come in already about outputs from this webinar. Will there be any notes? Yes, there will be. We'll be sending presentations around. They'll be uploaded to the outcome mapping website, and as well as the video of this webinar, which we're currently recording. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Richard, who's going to kick off the presentation.
Wonderful. Good morning, everybody, or based on the poll, probably good afternoon to most of you, just about on balance. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. And thank you, Simon, very much for putting the study in context and providing that very helpful introduction. Just to reiterate, there were 3 of us behind this work, myself, John Muramoto, who will co-present with me today, and Cornelia Rasman, who would absolutely love to be with us today, but she simply couldn't escape. She will be as fascinated as John and I will be to hear your thoughts and to discuss our findings today and in the coming days and weeks. Turning to the purpose and objectives of the study, to build on what Simon said, the intended users defined here in the purpose of the study was the outcome mapping and learning community, its stewards, funders, and others interested in outcome mapping, with general interest in planning, monitoring, and evaluation, with the intention that the study 10 years into the creation of the outcome mapping methodology in 2001 would provide an overview of where, how and why outcome mapping has been used, the situations in which it's most useful and also where it's least useful, and take a look at the support needed and perhaps compare that to what's required based on the experience of users so far. And to look in some depth at the experiences of many of those who have used outcome mapping over the years in all kinds of situations, with the overall intention and purpose to further the use and development of outcome mapping and, as Simon said, the outcome mapping learning community. So specifically, the 3 objectives were to stimulate the outcome mapping learning community to update its database on outcome mapping uses and information on trainers and consultants and what support is available. Secondly, to contribute to a fuller understanding of outcome mapping through the way describing and capturing the ways in which outcome mapping has been adapted in the experience of users. And thirdly, to inform the development of training and support to address identified gaps. The study was undertaken over a period of about 6 months, not continuously, but over that period. And preliminary results were presented in February at the Outcome Mapping Lab. Looking at the methods we used, we created 2 Excel databases. One to capture and allow analysis of the case studies, the use examples of outcome mapping. that we collected, and the second database covered information on the practitioners, those who've used outcome mapping, whether in particular applications or more generally used it as trainers or those providing support, mentoring to in all sorts of situations to all kinds of users of outcome mapping. There were two types of data sources that we looked at. One was kind of document sources, very much online, the outcome mapping learning community and international development research community databases, websites. Secondly, the kind of online, anything we could find online through research in terms of case studies of outcome mapping use. And thirdly, interaction with lots of people, stewards and many others who pointed us to uses of outcome mapping. The second major area of our data was gained from the 24 in-depth interviews with users and consultants or trainers, which we undertook. Now, it's important, I think, from the outset here to define how we interpreted outcome mapping, because as will become clear through the presentation, many have used outcome mapping not necessarily in its entirety of all 3 stages and all 12 steps. So when we were looking for case studies of outcome mapping, what could we include? Well, we discussed this with the outcome mapping learning community stewards early on in the study and agreed that we would include any use examples, case studies, which made explicit reference to the use of one or more of the 12 outcome mapping steps. In addition, we also included approaches to planning, monitoring, or evaluation which cited OM concepts but did not explicitly use steps. These we call OM-inspired approaches. A couple of notes of caution when considering the findings and our conclusions. This could never have been a completely comprehensive assessment of all OM applications to date. It would have taken considerably more time or resources than was possible, but we do think it's indicative of the experiences and the support available so far in the first 10 years of outcome mapping. Second cautionary note is that intuitively we feel that probably those who participated so willingly in interviews were more likely to have a positive view of outcome mapping than others. That said, we did have a very high response rate to interview requests, and many were very freely sharing problems with us as well as solutions. So we do feel that we gained a lot of insights into issues and difficulties as well as ways of overcoming them in using outcome mapping. Turning now to the data sources, we collected data on 123 case studies from, as I mentioned, the outcome mapping learning community, IDRC, and 46 of these case studies were from news sources, from our personal communications or research, which we believe is a significant advance in the data already held by the community, and hopefully will be a useful resource going forward as the databases we created are made available in the future. A word on the databases. We will not look at those in detail here today, but they may prove useful for stimulating the stewards of the community more widely in considering what kind of data to capture on case studies going forwards. For example, we found it very useful to identify for each case study that we could pursue by interview issues, solutions, and benefits of using outcome mapping. These could be fields which users of outcome mapping are invited to contribute data on in the future. And we'll be looking now in the next section of this presentation much more at issues, solutions, and benefits of outcome mapping. And I'll pass now to John Muramoto to tell you about the findings of our study, and I'll come back to you after that to tell you about some of our conclusions. Over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Richard and Simon, for the introductions. And we're looking now at the findings of the study. So first of all, where and in what context OM has been used, which is essentially looking at all the 123 case studies. So we have a quantitative finding. And not surprisingly, the majority of the outcome mapping use has been in the economic south, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and Caribbean, Asia Pacific, South Asia, etc. But there are examples of uses in more economically developed regions. And something just to throw out there is the fact that conceptually it seems there's no reason why OM shouldn't be useful in situations other than in international development cooperation. And that's a possible discussion point as to what could be done to promote the use of OM beyond developing country context. In terms of sectors in which OM was applied, it was typically when classifying things it's quite difficult to decide at the boundaries, so we had to make some of these classifications, they could be fairly subjective. But overall you can see from this the very high diversity of sectors in which OM has been used. A striking thing to us was that OM covers behavioral change, covers social change, but really there's an element of behavioral change in many components which might be thought to be more service delivery classically. So it covers a wide range of sectors. One thing that struck us, the three of us, because we all come from a natural science background and an environmental and biodiversity conservation field, is that there was a lack of case studies from the field in which we've cut our teeth. And we feel that there is a lot of scope for use of outcome mapping in environmental projects, biodiversity conservation projects, and it's again something that could be discussed at some point. The other part of the study, as Richard said, was the user interviews, where we got direct first-hand experiences of users, and it was very nice scrolling through the attendee list to note that some of the interviewees are present here. And we got an absolutely fantastic response. Our interviews were going to be up to 1 hour maximum, but they ended up being up to 3 hours in duration, and we certainly captured a rich variety of experiences. One overwhelming positive was the passion of those involved for planning, monitoring, evaluation, and for the use of outcome mapping. That was a big overall take-home message. So looking at the motivation, benefits, challenges, solutions, and training in this section, the motivations for the use of OM we could essentially classify under 5 heads. Firstly, there was enthusiasm for OM, so there's a very positive motivation, a pull factor to use the methodology for various reasons, which we can go into a little bit later. There was also the opposite. There was also this push factor, which was dissatisfaction on LFA approaches for various reasons, such as the causality, such as the fairly rigid planning framework, and such as the need to ostensibly capture impact, which is very, very difficult in projects and in all types of projects. Linked to this was a recommendation from colleagues, so people had talked about their needs for their projects or programs and the kind of approaches they could use in planning, monitoring, and evaluation. And OM has been recommended from colleagues, and then those exponents or future exponents would then look further into the method. People were very aware that outcome mapping is not yet certainly a mainstream method, so rather than jumping in with both feet, very often people would pilot that as an alternative approach to the prevailing methods used. So several of our studies were pilots where they could try the methods and the approaches on a small scale and then possibly upscale at a later date. And finally, it was the method being used by the organization at the time. The particular individual became involved with the work, so it was essentially it was the prevailing planning, monitoring, and evaluation approach in the organization at that time, which was mostly a minority. An overall message is a big wow there. An overall message is that OM was extremely appreciated by all the interviewees. By the way, all the text in italics are direct quotes. So we have these wonderful quotes such as focusing on change in social actors that you only influence as a breakthrough. I've heard described as a revelation, an epiphany, and revolutionary. I certainly, and along with Richard and Connie, experienced similar wow moments when first becoming aware of OM, in particular the contribution attribution emphasis. Really made a lot of sense of the work we were doing for me and really unblocked quite a few things that were blocking my own work. This quote summarizes again, I've come to appreciate OM as an attempt to be intellectually honest about results-based management. Log frame approaches expect a direct link to results. In OM, it's explicitly recognized that the results will not be solely attributable to the project intervention or project or intervention, rather the project will contribute to results. And that was certainly the aspect that really first galvanized my interest in outcome mapping. We did a survey in terms of levels of satisfaction with outcome mapping on a scale of 5 being the highest and 1 being the lowest, and the mean level of satisfaction was 4, which was generally satisfied but with some exceptions. So overall there's a very, very positive view of the approach. And this is reflected in the appreciation for outcome mapping concepts. This idea of an outcome orientation, forcing people to use outcomes-orientated planning approaches, whereas in spite of what is necessary, is advocated, programs are often planned from back to front, are planned from the front, i.e. activity-oriented rather than results-oriented. So outcome mapping really does force people to use this outcome-oriented approach. The concept of outcomes as behavioral change, previously described there as an epiphany, and several of our interviewees mentioned this paradigm shift, which helps people to realize that to achieve results we need to change attitudes. And we were struck from both from our own work and from the interviews just how widely this was appreciated. The concept of boundary partners and spheres of control, influence, and concern, and this allowed people to really focus and be modest and honest about their scope and influence. And as I already mentioned personally in my own experience, something that really helped me unblock and tackle some issues was the idea of attribution or contribution. And this quote is, I came to appreciate OM as an attempt to be intellectually honest about results-based management. So it's acknowledged up front that results will not be solely attributable to the project. So these were really this kind of aha moment, as we call it in the report, when people grasp the power of the method, one of its components, or the underlying concepts, the means of making sense of the environment in which they're working, as really a way of thinking which can permeate all of their work. More specifically, we looked at appreciation of the stages in outcome mapping and the steps. In terms of the intentional design or planning stage, it's been mentioned that there's nothing more useful than OM in terms of planning. And this focus again, which is linked to the previous slide when mentioning boundary partners, this quote which I really especially like, stop trying to change the world, focus on your sphere of influence, tell me about 3 to 4 boundary partners, not 90 stakeholders. So this idea of focus was very, very prominent. And this use of OM concepts for project or program planning, which is where this particular person found most deficits in partners' capacity. And explicitly, what I particularly like about this quote is explicitly they're making a link between the planning side and the monitoring side. So although this is divided, the method is divided into stages, it was very clear in many cases that people were aware of the links. So well planned is half monitored. However, there are also issues regarding outcome mapping that our interviewees brought up. And in terms of planning and design, one of the issues was people's background. And I love the phrase, letting go of your LFA history. The people familiar with traditional PME approaches may struggle with an approach that appears to be imprecise and fluid. So to some extent, it's very valuable, and we'll touch upon this later in the presentation. It's very valuable to have a solid background in monitoring and planning and evaluation approaches. There's also an element of unlearning possibly that needs to be undertaken. So part of the solutions that people offered was the idea of mentoring for a continuous learning approach. And really, there was this notion of the fact that people will leave a initial training workshop full of ideas, full of enthusiasm, and full of zeal. But when it comes to actually implementing the approach, then they will discover roadblocks and additional issues that at first were not apparent. So it's then very, very easy to fall back on something that's very familiar, either to you or to those around you. So this idea of OM mentoring was something that came up again and again as part of this continuous learning approach, because obviously you cannot get all of the issues across in a single workshop or single training. And there's a continuous learning as part of an action learning cycle, which is something we may touch upon later. This fact came up many times. Plans can be very heavy and practical, where there are numerous boundary partners, long lists of progress markers and overlapping support strategies. And in most cases where people were very positive about the results they achieved and the use of the method, people adapted their plans so that they were situationally responsive. We will go into this in more detail later. And involving boundary partners in planning can be a challenge because these partners either lack time or inclination for engagement, and partners put in inverted commas because very often these partners, especially in things like advocacy projects, may be closer to adversaries than partners. So although there's this ideal of involving boundary partners in the setting of outcome mapping, of outcome challenges, of progress markers, and the whole planning and monitoring and evaluation approach, it's not always going to be possible, and in some cases won't even be desirable, but it may be possible to gather as much information as you can so you can sensibly formulate outcome challenges and progress markers for those social actors with whom you're seeking to work. So people did come up with complementary approaches to deal with this particular issue. In terms of monitoring, there was, again, a high level of appreciation for monitoring, and this approach that was very, very closely linked to learning was highlighted. So with outcome mapping, you're always monitoring your strategy. If it's not working, you change something. It provides evidence to base decision making on. Quarterly planning meetings are based on evidence, not the views of the most assertive participants. One particular interview is very, very keen on this approach for evaluative thinking, reflective practice that uses systematically collected data to inform action. So felt that this approach, where you are monitoring very, very regularly and you are changing according to the evidence that you get, was very, very powerful. And the second quote summarizes something similar. It's great for organizational learning. And this points out the importance of the fact that you're not only trying to work across programs and programs, but you're also working in an organization. So you're dealing with the organization as well as the program, which was considered to be a very, very powerful approach for organizational learning. In terms of issues, this touches upon a point made earlier that trying to do it by the book can be very, very demanding. And it's important not to get too enmeshed in the detail because you might obscure the bigger picture. And you get this picture of outcome mapping overload, where you're overloaded with data, and fall back into what was called report mode, which to our way of thinking is essentially compliance. However, the counterpoint, where there's already a very, very strong M&E culture, it was not seen as an additional burden. So it really depended on the state of the organization, and that will be, at that point will be taken up in more detail by Richard later when he looks at the extensiveness of outcome mapping and how that relates to a situation of an organization. In terms of solutions that were offered, is a selective use of some of the steps and of some journals, of folding the journal into one single journal. Rather than using journals, using face-to-face meetings of project teams and boundary partners, and this was considered to be particularly important in societies where there's a strong oral tradition and not such a strong reporting tradition, and use of complementary methods such as focus group discussions, key informant interviews, and techniques used in participatory rural appraisal. So there's various ways in which people got around some of these issues of the heaviness or the possible heaviness of monitoring. In terms of evaluation, back to the idea of the OM concepts being very powerful, the OM concept of outcomes helps people think differently about evaluation differently. Does not handcuff participants. So this was an idea that having an evaluation where you're looking at the outcomes engendered by the program means you're not being handcuffed to the project plan. Of course, equally, a similar evaluation could be constraining if the evaluation is only based on the predefined outcome challenge and progress markers. But in this case, they were looking at the thing very, very openly in terms of the outcomes that actually happened and the degree of contribution from that project or program. There's an OM-inspired evaluation methodology which many of you will be familiar with called outcome harvesting, and suggesting capturing what others can already see. But in this case, the evaluation produced outcome statements were unexpected, as they'd not been captured in the monitoring that the particular team had been doing. And they were surprised and impressed by the contributions their program had made. So again, this is a very, very open approach of seeing what actually happened, which has been inspired by the outcome mapping concept of outcomes as behavioral change. In terms of issues, the evaluation planning step is very brief. It's, from my personal opinion, it's a very useful introduction to evaluation, but the step is very brief relative to the other two. And it was stated in this case that OM is currently more useful in planning and monitoring and less so for evaluation purposes. But certainly it has inspired evaluations and captured behavioral change outcomes to which an intervention contributes. And that's whether the intervention has been planned using outcome mapping or not. And that relates to the second point, where outcome harvesting and other OM-inspired approaches can be used, whether an OM was used for designing or monitoring the intervention or not. And there have been several approaches of evaluation using OM-inspired approaches, but it was the area where we struggled to find many examples compared to the use in planning and in monitoring. And Richard will touch upon that point later. So training, there's this notion that there may be a mismatch. But before going into those points, we'd like to say that training has generally been appreciated, and the resources available on the OM Outcome Mapping Learning Community website and elsewhere have found to be really helpful for developing training and for further support. However, there was this feeling, and it's not exclusive to training in outcome mapping, that training is a pulse that can sometimes be a one-off, and then the trainees are left essentially to fend for themselves. And this wonderful quote, seagull approach, the land, defecate, or words to that effect, and leave, as you can see from the slide here, illustrated very graphically, that many people felt that the training that was offered needed to go beyond this seagull approach. Also, some people who had been involved in training felt that it would be very valuable if the introductory training could be given to those in similar situations rather than mixed group, because it's very difficult to cater to people's different levels, to people's different knowledge levels, to people's different subject matter expertise, people's different M&E backgrounds, etc. In mixed groups. And support is needed for implementing partners to get the reflection learning cycle moving. So again, the point that I alluded to earlier, that people would go out full of passion, full of expectation, full of hope, and full of enthusiasm, but then getting to the point where this planning cycle and action learning cycle was really operating and really working can be very, very difficult without additional support, ongoing support. Mentoring was a word that came up many times. Overall, the findings suggested a need for more trainers and consultants experienced in using outcome mapping in a range of sectors, and of training and learning tools in multiple languages and locations in the economic south, which is certainly a challenge. There was generally felt to be a shortage of training, and Richard will be talking a little bit later about maybe how to make the best use of that limited resource. So I will hand over to Richard now for the section on conclusions and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much indeed. I'll move straight into the conclusions and suggestions, the first of which, for those who've been listening carefully, should be no surprise. Adaptation when using outcome mapping has been the norm. So hence the headline here on this slide, never cook by the book. In fact, this was always the intention in the outcome as expressed by the authors of the outcome mapping manual on page 11, that adaptation is the norm, but as they stated back in 2001, the manual itself doesn't provide the reader with instructions on how to adapt outcome mapping. So let's see what lessons we've derived from the from our study, from our case studies and interviews. We identified 4 ways in which outcome mapping has been adapted. The first of which is to use only some of the stages or steps. The second is the use of one or more of the key concepts, but without necessarily any of the steps. Thirdly, you don't have to start with design or planning. My own personal experience was starting with monitoring and trying to understand what kind of changes the network I was supporting had actually been making, and that then informed strategic planning later on. Lastly, using outcome mapping with other approaches in planning, monitoring and evaluation, the logical framework approach, most significant change, many others. This slide, use of outcome mapping with other approaches, is an exploded view of the mind map we used in order to analyze the data. And on the left there, just as a list of that we have found have been used with outcome mapping. And we can come back to look at some of those in more detail if listeners, participants are interested. I'm thinking further how outcome mapping can be adapted and how to decide how to adapt it to particular situations. We came up with the idea that perhaps there are enabling factors which help determine to what extent, what level of involvement, complexity, outcome mapping can be used. This was informed by the findings and by our own experience using outcome mapping in planning and in evaluation. We identified that 3 of these proposed 8 enabling factors to be essential for any use of outcome mapping. The first of which is complexity, by which we mean uncertainty about results or how your intervention will contribute to results. This can be for many, many reasons. For example, that recognizing that your intervention will only influence others to realize results. You cannot actually control whether they will produce the results that you want, such as in campaigning organizations, for example. Or with networks where members define objectives through their interaction and in response to opportunities. You don't know what all the results you're going to want to achieve are when you set out. You have to be responsive. This is a complex environment. So and that is something that we found to be essential, and we found defined all of the case studies that we looked at in most depth through the interviews had a significant element of complexity in their project environment. Secondly, it's really important that the rationale for using outcome mapping was appreciated, and by which we mean that to understand the idea that you as an influencing entity has a sphere of control, but then you have a sphere of influence and you have a sphere of concern, that you're trying to influence behavior, that you can only contribute to, not control the results in those that you're working with, etc. And that you want to encourage learning and innovation and be responsive to those that you're working with. If you appreciate these factors, and then that's, we think, a necessary, essential factor if you're going to use outcome mapping. Thirdly, you need, we suggest, a champion within your organization, within the part of the organization that's wanting to use outcome mapping. Just as in introducing anything new, anywhere, you need someone who says, you know, this is going to be my baby, this is going to be something that I promote and keep my eye on, and keep pushing and supporting people in the organization with. For that, they may very well need technical support. It could mean that the manual may be enough for them. They may be well versed in planning, monitoring, and evaluation, and the manual may be all they need. They might very well draw on the outcome mapping learning community. They may well need a mentor. There's all sorts of different levels of support that might be required for particular uses. Then we have another 5, what we've defined as optional enabling factors for understanding in your situation how involved your use of outcome mapping can be to be useful. Because if we learned from the interviews and analysis of case studies, those who dived in and tried to do kind of what could be described as a heavy approach of using many of the steps in outcome mapping as described in the manual, sometimes came unstuck when they didn't have all these enabling factors in place. So the optional enabling factors, the first 2, if you've got funder support or executive level support in your organization, that can be obviously enormously helpful. 6 and 7, if you've got already an organizational learning culture, that you're not only just trying to use monitoring and evaluation for compliance with funder requirements, but you have an active learning culture. And that, in point number 7, is something that permeates the organization, not just within the M&E unit in the organization or the M&E officer. Those can be incredibly important enabling factors. And then lastly, sufficient resources. We didn't think that having resources is an essential factor for using outcome mapping, because as John said and one of our informants said, the outcome mapping at its most basic is a way of thinking. So taking that, you don't necessarily need resources, but if you're going to use, depending on how you're going to use outcome mapping, you need sufficient resources to use it in a more extensive way. Now, how can someone, considering those enabling factors, how can you look at your situation if you're thinking of using outcome mapping or you're already using it and see, okay, is outcome mapping suitable, and if so, how involved an application of outcome mapping should we attempt? This figure's attempt to the outcome mapping receptivity continuum is attempting to convey the idea that if you have only 1 or 2 of the essential enabling factors, then your situation is really not suitable for outcome mapping. If you've got at least the 3 essential enabling factors, then your situation is appropriate for what we could say is a simple use of outcome mapping. This may well be the optimal use of outcome mapping in your situation. There's no need, in our view, that a more extensive use of more and more of the steps is the optimal. If what the people, one of the examples we had of an organization promoting change in affiliated organizations, changes in approaches to conceiving their work in influencing campaigning work. If the organizations you work with change their way to always be thinking in terms of behavior change that they're trying to bring about, then that's a simple use of outcome mapping. You have adopted a concept from outcome mapping and you're using that without using any of the steps. This is what we mean by simple. If you've got the essential enabling factors and one or more of the optional enabling factors, you can try a more, it may well benefit you, we suggest, to have a more extensive use of outcome mapping. Conclusions and suggestions about training support and learning resources. As John said, indicated many users lack the confidence needed to adapt outcome mapping in their situation and sometimes can run out of steam after the initial training. We suggest 3 areas of focus here. The first is what we call building on some earlier work by others. Step 0 training component, which at the very onset of your considering to use outcome mapping should include the following. Helping you identify simple, complicated and complex situations to determine if outcome mapping is relevant to your situation. Secondly, outcome mapping and other planning, monitoring, and evaluation concepts should be introduced and their relationships explored, so that outcome mapping isn't necessarily seen as a replacement, but something that can sit alongside and complement and inform and enrich your planning, monitoring, and evaluation work. Thirdly, the enabling factors and the receptivity continuum I just introduced should be introduced to potential users of outcome mapping to help with examples of OM uses at different points in that continuum to understand, to help people understand, visualize their intervention and what level of outcome mapping would be appropriate. The second area of support and learning which we suggest deserves some further attention is mentoring. And one area particularly promising from our perspective, from what we learned from our findings and also personal experience, is remote mentoring, such that a champion in an organization who's taking on board to be the main channel of outcome mapping, learning and disseminating that and supporting colleagues in using outcome mapping ideas, is themselves supported in an ongoing way, at least in the initial months and years of improving their monitoring and evaluation using outcome mapping. The cost could be very modest indeed, a few $1,000s a year, but if they could have access to someone with more expertise and experience, a trainer or mentor, in an ongoing basis, on an on-need basis, or perhaps every twice a year or what have you, that could really, really help, we suggest, and make use of existing limited expertise in the world in outcome mapping, so that such that the trainer doesn't need to be visiting a huge expense all of the different offices, but they could work remotely via Skype and email, commenting on documents, having occasional Skype discussions, etc. Thirdly, we propose that an e-learning tool is considered by the outcome mapping learning community in order to better encourage outcome mapping adaptations through a structured access to largely existing resources within the outcome mapping learning community, which through exploring for our work and this project, found the resources in the outcome mapping learning community to be incredibly rich. But we feel that you need to have a level of drive or self-learning motivation to go in there and find what you're looking for. It doesn't so easily present itself as a way. It doesn't, for example, provide a way in for those who want to consider outcome mapping ideas and approaches in evaluation. How would they go about it? They could use a free text search in the outcome mapping learning community and pull up everything that mentions the word evaluation, but that's going to lead them astray into all sorts of materials because an awful lot of materials mention evaluation. Which one of those are going to help them develop their thinking on using outcome mapping in evaluation? So what we're suggesting is a structured access to this resources and to link to some key other external sites too, so that the idea of adapting and using outcome mapping for planning, monitoring, evaluation can be further promoted. And in particular, not least in terms of evaluation, which there is great interest and some experience which should be fostered and shared further. Now turning to my last area of conclusions and suggestions, donors and the logical framework approach, which are very often inseparably wedded, as two of the quotations here indicate. Suggesting that outcome mapping is inconsistent with the way donors work, because outcome mapping, as says another informant, and the logical framework approach, LFA, are incompatible. The outcome mapping, of course, assumes multiple non-linear cause and effects, causes leading to change, whereas the logical framework approach assumes a linear cause-effect relationship. But despite this potential incompatibility and certainly attention, we found 36 funders have supported interventions that used outcome mapping. And that's almost certainly an underestimate, because we were not able to scrutinize the documents, and we didn't set out to capture that information in an exhaustive sense, but only where we could identify the funder relatively easily, we recorded that. So it has been widely used. But interestingly, most funders are probably unaware when outcome mapping has been used because of the strategies used when employing outcome mapping. Some have used the term using outcome mapping by stealth. Basically, you use it and you use ideas from outcome mapping, but you don't use the terminology, or so hence the funder isn't aware. For example, if you use the idea of behavioral change in defining your objectives within the logical framework, you don't necessarily tell that to the funder, but you've certainly been informed by outcome mapping in your design. Secondly, very commonly, people have used outcome mapping internally for planning and monitoring work within an organization or project, but use the logical framework approach for reporting to donors. And many people, although they recognize there is a burden with that, many have found it to be an incredibly productive way of working. So to end here really with some proposals for the outcome mapping learning community, for anyone interested in furthering the use of outcome mapping, to consider that after 10 years of outcome mapping, there is really a lot of potential to further promote it to foundations and funders. For example, through donor-specific training and ongoing support in participatory planning, monitoring, and evaluation in general. Secondly, to promote outcome mapping not only necessarily as a standalone set of tools and concepts, but as something to be a toolbox to be drawn upon, and that can work with the logical framework approach and others which are not going to go away anytime soon, and certainly have their relevance and suitability in particular situations. Thirdly, to publicize better how outcome mapping adds value to other approaches. Fourthly, to seek champions within donors, and there are some who are very people who have significant experience and interest in outcome mapping within donors, to better support them in facilitating and sharing their experiences among other donors. And lastly, to describe where outcome mapping is most and least useful, so that donors can see it's not some attempt to take over the world, but it's a sophisticated contribution to monitoring and evaluation. That brings me to the end of the conclusions and suggestions, and I'm keen to press on and allow the discussion to start. I'll just end with a huge thank you to all of you for participating today, the stewards, not least Kaia and Simon here today, and perhaps most of all to the, as John had mentioned, the interviewees who gave enormously of their time to contribute to what we found to be a hugely rich and enjoyable study. Thank you very much.
This is Kaia Ambrose speaking. As Simon mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I'm the Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Manager at CARE Canada, and I've also been a outcome mapping steward for several years. And I've been applying outcome mapping and using outcome mapping since about 2000. So I've been around since its creation. So the work that the team has done, that John, Richard, and Quinn, interesting for me and for many outcome mapping users, but I think even more than interesting, it's been quite useful. Should be use focused, and I think the work that they've done really embodies that, really supports that use orientation. Just as a very quick example of some of the ways that we, and I mean the outcome mapping learning community stewards, think that we can use this report. A few examples that we've thought of. First of all, the report, I'll just reiterate, is available through the Outcome Mapping Learning Community website, as well as a summary. We wanted to create a 4-page summary to give a snapshot of the breadth John and Richard presented today. Beyond that, what we hope to do is to create a 2-page donor brief, something that anyone can pull out, download, and use to advocate for more support for outcome mapping application. As well, we'll be pulling out a lot of the pieces from the report for an upcoming, what we're calling a practitioner guide. This guide it will be a complement to the outcome mapping manual with some of the new tools and new ways of application that people have found to be successful. We're going to be compiling that into a very use-oriented document, and we'll be using some of the things like the continuum essential factors piece that Richard just spoke about. We also hope to update the frequently asked questions on the website, on the Outcome Mapping Learning Community website, using the information from the report. And finally, many of you will have seen Jan van Ongeval's email about OM effectiveness and the survey around outcome mapping effectiveness. So we'll be tying in pieces of the report with his effectiveness study report. So certainly quite a bit of planned use, and I think it would be interesting for all of us to think about how we can use the information from this extensive research. I just want to mention briefly, I want to talk about 4 pieces of the report that I think would be interesting for us as a community to, and as individual outcome mapping practitioners as well, or soon to be potential practitioners to explore further. The first one that I believe is on page 21 of the report refers to the planning, monitoring, evaluation approaches that have been used with outcome mappings. And I've found that in trainings or in presentations around outcome mapping, it's a very common question. What are the other methodologies that I can use with outcome mapping? Do I need to use it straight up, or can I combine it with other things? And as John, Richard, and Cornelia have discovered and have revealed in the report, that in practice adaptation is a lot more common than using OM quote-unquote straight up. The summary in the report is of those other methodologies in which people have applied combined outcome mapping is a really useful reference. First of all, just to see a list of those PM&E approaches that are compatible with outcome mapping, but also as a potentially promotional piece to show that outcome mapping is not necessarily a standalone piece that requires more or extra resources, but something that can be incorporated into existing PM&E practice and provide added value. So I think that's an interesting piece to highlight. The next one, which is on page 32 of the report, and Richard presented a slide, the continuum slide, around essential factors. What are the factors that we need to consider if we want to effectively apply outcome mapping? And I think this could potentially be extracted and be made into a checklist of sorts, sort of like a readiness assessment, and turned into a really useful tool for people who are interested in using outcome mapping or pieces of outcome mapping to judge what they need in their institutional context to make it work. The third one is on page 24 of the report, and I believe the title of it is Aha Moments. What were the aha moments that the interviewees experienced in using outcome mapping? And I think the report gives a very nice summary that could give potential outcome mapping users and trainers as well an idea of where they might want to focus a training or an introduction of outcome mapping to a team, for example. Seeing a pattern of where people have really anchored their enthusiasm in outcome mapping, I think really reveals and confirms what in practice have been the most important pieces of the methodology. And I think that has useful implications for how we design, for example, training or what kind of angle, if we're introducing outcome mapping to a team that doesn't know about it, what kind of angle we might want to go in with. And then finally on page 38 of the report, and Richard also discussed this as well in his part of the presentation, suggestions of how to improve training. I find these especially useful for those who train or support training of outcome mapping to envision what a training package might look like. But I also think that it could provide some useful fuel for those individuals or organizations who are interested in gaining more outcome mapping knowledge. I think their suggestions shed light on the types of things that they should be considering to incorporate in a training or what that training could look like. So the types of things that they should be demanding, perhaps not just a one-off workshop, but be demanding a mentoring piece as well, or push for some e-learning as well. So those are the four areas that really struck me in the report as an outcome mapping user and as a steward as well, and that I think have a lot of potential for further extracting and working with. Based on those two pieces, I'd just like to ask John and Richard two questions. The first one is around the essential factors, that outcome mapping continuum diagram. And when I was reading the report, it really struck me as something new. I hadn't seen it laid out like that anywhere else. I'd just like to ask them how they came up with it and how you think people could use it practically. I've just mentioned that I think a checklist of sorts could be interesting, but what was your vision when you put it together, that particular diagram? And the second question is on the topic of training. And in the report and in the presentation, you mentioned the need to develop training based on user needs. From the research, do you have any ideas about how to best tailor a training? And I put training in air quotes. Maybe it's not even called a training. Who and what should be involved? For example, do you bring in your idea of them being incorporated into other PME training? You also talk about unlearning in the report. So a few more thoughts based on on the information that you gathered, what that training might look like. So those are the two questions that I'd like to pose to the researchers, the presenters, and then from there, I believe we'll open it up to other questions.
Thank you, Kaia. Richard, here, if I take the first question, and thank you very much for your observations, much to reflect on. Your question about the enabling factors and how we came upon them and how we envisaged they may be useful. Well, they were informed fundamentally by our findings and reflecting on the findings in this study, but also by our own experience of introducing outcome mapping as a planning approach and in a network, and in using outcome mapping in evaluations. And we were really struck by at least two motivating factors, I think. One was that the idea that outcome mapping can be used in a very simple way, in a sense. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking that you have multiple. You are one of multiple actors influencing change, and really sustainable change in any sense involves behavior change. So if you adopt some of this thinking, and if we say that is using outcome mapping, then it gets us down to some real essentials of what you need to do that. And the second motivation was that we found that too many examples of people running into some kind of roadblocks when they try to do monitoring too heavily, too intensively, or follow too many of the steps, which didn't really fit with their situation at that particular time in their organization. So we wanted to think through, okay, how can we help the simpler users see more clearly that OM is valuable, but it's not a kind of take it or leave it all in approach. You can pick and choose steps and concepts. And I pass over to John to address the training question.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much also to Kaia for a very useful wrap-up and some very good points regarding where to go from here and how to use our findings. Regarding training based on what we found, well, I think we've come up with some of the issues already, and I think Kaia mentioned some as well. This is something that would have to be discussed in much more detail, but just initial thoughts are that in an ideal world, you'd want some very much customized approaches depending on the group. And in an equally ideal world, perhaps that group should be relatively homogeneous. So people from the same organizations, maybe similar interest groups such as donors, maybe similar levels of planning, monitoring, evaluation experiences, or maybe a group of grantees under the same portfolio. Already touched upon, so I won't mention in much more detail, is the introduction of a module on step 0, so this preparation for the use of OM, and Richard went through our ideas for what that could involve. Really emphasizing these concepts that Kaia already pointed to under the aha moments as part of the report, and that I presented, if I can get it up on the screen here. The appreciation for the OM concepts, which we felt are very, very powerful in terms of, just in terms of thinking about project management as a whole. So to discuss and understand those concepts, which are not exclusive to OM, but the way it's combined into a coherent methodology is, as far as I know, exclusive to OM. And I think this has been emphasized by Kaia, by Richard and myself, and was very, very clear from the study that the flexibility of the method, and that was pretty much came in from the start in the manual, but is not always been maintained in practice. The flexibility of the approach, there isn't a one-size-fits-all, and it can be adapted and used with other approaches. So the thing, again, that Kaia emphasizes, the other approaches that can be used with outcome mapping in your planning, monitoring, evaluation framework. And emphasize the iterative nature and the continuous nature of this process. So linking with things like the action learning cycle of action, reflection, learning, planning, and action, to link it with these kind of concepts, I think is very, very useful to emphasize the iterative nature of the process. And last but by no means least, again, something that has been touched upon by everybody and came out very loud and clear in the survey, this idea of follow-up mentoring and this issue of people maybe lacking the confidence as they implement the program, and also coming up with some issues that wouldn't have been foreseen, which of course is part and parcel of the philosophy behind outcome mapping. But of course, it's something that I think there should be a further dialogue on within the community, and I'd be extremely interested to be part of that dialogue.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Richard.
Thanks, I'm done.
and also thank you, Kaia, for those questions. We do have some time for some questions from you, but we are running drastically out of time, I'm afraid. We've received quite a few questions. I'm going to prioritize the ones that relate specifically to the presentation. There's quite a few questions in general about outcome mapping and different parts of outcome mapping and how outcome mapping relates to other approaches. I'm going to leave those for now because we don't have time to cover them all, but we have made a note of them, and we may use them in the outcome mapping community discussions. So look out there for your question if it comes up. Okay, so just picking up on one question that came in, and I think this is a question for any of the presenters, and it comes in from Robin Beecroft, and he asks, are there any examples of funders who remain resolutely skeptical about outcome mapping, even after experiencing its application in a project they have funded? And I don't know if anything came up in your interviews, Richard and John, or from your experience, Kaia, about that.
I'm happy to go first with it. Relatively short answer of no. It doesn't mean that there aren't hostile reactions from funders, but I guess they're harder to find out. The funders that we did speak to directly, we have direct experience with, have found these mapping inspired approaches to be useful and informative. I'm not sure if Kaia or John have anything to add.
Sure, I might just add that I probably don't want to name names, but from experience, I think there's, because there in the world I'm working in right now, there is such a push for, again, I'll use some air quotes, rigorous impact evaluation. There's a lot of skepticism of how outcome mapping can contribute to that, and what I've seen is because of that skepticism, then there's a tendency to put it to the side. So I think that's a job for us as outcome mapping promoters to explore how outcome mapping can, if and can it contribute to impact evaluation, and promote that.
Thanks. There's another question which may be most relevant for Kaia, but I think could be for any of us. Comes from Mark Dumont. Why are there so few applications of outcome mapping in North America? And has it something to do with the approach itself?
No, I don't think it has to do with the approach itself, and I actually think there's quite a few applications that I know of in Canada, and perhaps they weren't at the time they weren't considered in the research, but certainly myself and Heidi Schaefer, who's another steward based in Toronto, and Terry Smatillo, who is one of the authors of outcome mapping. Certainly we do a lot of work with Canadian organizations, First Nations organizations, for example, right across the country. I think it's a question of getting those cases written up. In general, perhaps there's not as much because it was a methodology developed by the International Research Development Center, which has its work in the geographic south, and that's where the methodology was rolled out.
Great. I realize in terms of timing we are at 1/2 the hour, which is when we were due to finish, but I see that there's still quite a lot of people online. We're going to carry on taking a couple more questions, maybe another 5 or 10 minutes if the presenters will let me. I'm going to eke as much as I can out of their time. But if you do need to go, please please don't feel obliged to stick around. So just another question has come in from Sally Andrade. How can evaluators new to outcome mapping, but with hopes of becoming champions, how can they access appropriate technical support and/or OM mentors? And I think this refers to some of the comments the presenters made about having mechanisms to provide appropriate technical support. I might have a go at this, answering this one.
Yeah.
And because I think it is part of the mission of the outcome mapping learning community to provide people, especially people new to the approach, with a way of learning and exploring more. And it's not something we've done very structured. So there's no official mentoring program that we put out there, but partnerships have been formed through the community on an informal basis, and we do encourage that. So people often would post their questions, post a question like, I'm new to the approach, can anyone who's in my neighborhood offer any support for me? And there's been a few partnerships like that have been formed. So we do encourage you to share a little bit of information about who you are and what your needs are, and where you're based and what kind of sector you're working in, because then we can try and match you up with someone who may have some good advice for you. Also, we are going to be updating our website soon, which should make it easier to find outcome mapping experts or people who have are sort of advertising themselves as consultants and trainers. So that will make it easier for you to find people around where you live who are able to offer some professional support.
Can I just add, Simon, I think you've been very successful in that on an informal basis, that partner matching. So under the plans for the new website, do you plan on making that that more upfront, that function? Because I know you've been doing it, and you've done it with me, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, there are ways in which technology can help us. There may be some things we can do with the website, but I think in general it'll continue happening either through us brokering relationships offline, or just through people meeting through the email discussion list. Okay, let's pick up another question. There was one. Sorry, there's quite a few just come in now. this kind of relates to the question that we just had. And the question comes from Rami Unita. Are you happy to see the level of outreach in the outcome mapping community? Do you think that there are outcome mapping practitioners out there that are not used to e-learning or internet-based collaboration? And maybe John or Richard, you can respond to this based on your recommendations.
That's a difficult question to answer definitively, but you certainly get the impression from the interactions we've had that people have quite an evangelical zeal and are very keen to communicate about outcome mapping. I've experienced that in East Africa with the community there, where we've been doing various projects, that there's some very, very keen and motivated practitioners who are very much communicating and very much trying to outreach. And I think the recent study that's come out in Eastern Africa would back that up. An issue I think also is language, which was highlighted as the problem, and in a negative sense, and also the lack of expertise in many parts of the world. I get the impression this is based purely on a few examples that I know, and not on anything systematic, is that those who are involved are very passionate and are very generous with their time and keen to communicate and mentor. But there is probably a lack of absolute numbers and resources in the appropriate languages.
Thanks, and also just to,
yeah, if I could just
sorry, I'll go first, and then you can go, Richard.
Sure.
We also try to, you know, as much as we can, support face-to-face meetings as well. And you know, it's very difficult because we don't have a huge amount of funding, so we can't fund a lot of events. But we do try to sort of piggyback on things that are going on in different regions in the world, different conferences, for example, and to provide a face-to-face space where people can learn more about the approach. Go on, Richard.
Yeah, just to add that, I mean, I understood the question was also kind of potentially possibly suggesting that the internet connectivity and the very kind of working remotely and being motivated or comfortable with working with a remote e-learning resource might not suit everybody or might not be possible for everybody. So just to supplement really what you're saying, Simon, that what was in our mind was that this building on the outcome mapping learning community resources, turning into more of a learning tool, would be something that could support champions. But that face-to-face contact, that needs to kind of feed down, and as John was saying, builds the capability and confidence of people in many countries, in many organizations, etc. But if this resource is there and continues to be strengthened, as Simon suggests it will be, that's a really important backbone, I think, but it's not obviously going to suit everyone, everywhere, all the time.
Can I just do a quick poll, actually, and just ask you to raise your hand if you would appreciate some kind of structured e-learning. So either, you know, future webinars that are focused on training, or an e-learning platform where you can, you know, go through some kind of structured process in your own time. So just raise your hand if that would be something you'd be interested in. Well, we've got a lot of hands going up. We've got 20, 22. Some people's hands are going down. Yeah, 20 people. So that's just under half of the attendees, which is quite good. So that's something that we'll definitely look into, and to watch this space. Let's just have another question. There's a couple of questions come in that are similar, from Jeff Matthais and Ricky Cuswadono. They both relate to sort of convincing people about outcome mapping. So Jeff asks, what strategies are there to convince people who do not believe in outcome mapping? And Ricky asks, what is outcome mapping learning communities' next steps to convince funders to use outcome mapping? I wonder if Kaia might have a go at this.
Sure. I like Richard and John pointed it out. They mentioned it on one slide in the presentation. They talked about outcome mapping by stealth. And just to give a quick example, in an organization that I did some general planning, monitoring, and evaluation work for, I knew that they were resistant to outcome mapping, so what I did was I actually took one piece of it. I took the piece around boundary partners and progress markers, and I didn't call them that. I used other terms that this organization was more familiar with, and we created a very practical tool that essentially measured pathways of change, of behavioral change using progress markers, and we set up a almost like a longitudinal type study where they would measure change in boundary partners every so often, and a system for tracking that change, and they loved it and they took to it very well, and I never mentioned that was outcome mapping until after the fact. I slowly brought in other pieces of it, so it was almost like doing a jigsaw puzzle and starting with one piece and then getting another piece on and getting another piece on, and at the end I said, well, this is what you have, and it's based on this methodology, and for that particular situation, that particular organization, it was it worked. They were convinced, if you want to use that word after that. But I really think it's about the doing, and certainly in my own experience, I never took a training, an outcome mapping training or anything like that. I had the manual and I kind of struggled through it and figured it out myself, and yeah, the classic learning by doing I think is important to realize. So if you can think of, if you're in a situation, you can think of a very practical exercise based on outcome mapping, and show how it's inserted in the overall PME system, then I think that's one way, certainly not the only way, but one way. And in terms of the outcome mapping learning community outreach to donors, as I mentioned, one of the things that we want to do is, from this report, not just the report, but using a lot of the information from the report, is create a type of brief that's punchy and inspiring and very clear about the added value of outcome mapping that anyone can use to talk to a donor and give as almost like a handout to a donor. So that's one thing that we'll be doing, is constructing that and making it available to everyone on the community.
Thanks. Okay, we'll just take one more question, and it's a quick one to Richard and John, and this comes from Albert Salamanca. So in your exploration of outcome mapping uses, did you see any use of outcome mapping in proposal development?
John, did we? That's a good one.
That's a very good question.
Very often it has been used at a later stage to kind of revisit at a formative evaluation stage, or to introduce to understand how a program is being implemented and make adjustments. Whether specifically we were aware of its use at the proposal stage, I'm struggling to think of an example off the top of my head, but I expect that there was.
I'm sure they were, but I couldn't say for absolute certainty that the ones that we looked at in depth were, but I'm absolutely positive that they are, and I see it as being very, very useful with proposal, developing especially where you've got the opportunity to get a grant proposal for developing, where you can do it as you would really like to by having a really participatory approach to developing a project. So I think it's got a huge scope.
Great.
Yeah, and guys just reminded me in terms of an example which we did see was actually in Canada, I think in Alberta, which was it's the use of outcome mapping to conceptualize the theory of change of an intervention right at the outset.
Very good, thank you. Okay, so we have gone over time, but we're coming into land now, and I'll just be closing the webinar. I just wanted to remind you before you go that we do have a series of webinars coming up. On the screen you'll see the next set of dates. So there are 4 scheduled throughout the next few months. The next one's in 2 weeks' time, October the 10th, and it's on measuring success in global networks, particularly looking at a case of applying outcome mapping in the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. And we'll have two people from that organization talking about how they've been using outcome mapping. So we really look forward to seeing you there. Also remember to check our website for updates. You can sign up for regular email updates that will tell you about new events, new resources added to the website, etc. So do take a visit at some point soon. Thank you very much for attending. It's been really great to have you. Thank you for your good questions. There's plenty that we didn't get to, but we will be posting those and we'll try and work our way through them because there's some great material there for us. Thank you to John and thank you to Richard for presenting. Also to your colleague Connie for her contributions to the report. And thank you to Kaia for agreeing to be a discussant and for sharing her perspectives. Great, and that's all we've got for today, so I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks.